Recording in progress.
We have started. So very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are back with another enterprising program, power-packed program on standards on internal audit. I have with me CA Saraj Jain, the Honorable Chairman of Sonipat branch, a young, dynamic chairman dedicated to the cause of this great profession, which was set up way back on 1st July 1949. And a belated happy CA Day, 73rd CA Day to all of you. I also have with me Mr. Bharat Garg, who heads the internal audit function of a great organization. I have seen him performing chartered accountant par excellence and internal auditor into the highest depth and loves taking into account challenges and performing at the highest levels. I have with me Madam Parul Agarwal, a young enterprising chartered accountant who shall act as a moderator of today's session. She has high hopes from this profession and wants to work to ensure that this profession goes up to the highest level. I have with me Madam Aarti Bansal, the secretary of this board, Mr. Sailesh Verma, who is the program coordinator and technical support people here. So over to Madam Parul for further.
Thank you, sir, for giving me such great honor to be a part of this session and an opportunity for me to take the best I can from this session. So before that, I would like to give a gist of your experiences. So Mr. Nandaji he's the chairman of Internal Audit Standard Board of the ICAI. Not even the chairman, he's also the founder chairman of the same. So then he's also the chairman of Committee of Management Accounting of ICAI, vice chairman of Continuing Professional Education Committee of the ICAI, and member on board of the 26th Committee of the ICAI. Thank you, sir. Now I would like Mr. Nandaji to kindly give the keynote address.
Madam, we have with us the chairman, Mr. Saraj Jain, so I would request him to first welcome the participants. He has come all the way from Sonipat. Please invite him and then I'll take it forward.
So, I would like to invite Mr. Suresh Jain for giving his opening remarks, and then we'll move forward.
Thank you, Parul ma'am. Very good evening to all of you. Sonipat branch के सभी members का and from all other parts of India के सभी members का आज के हमारे webinar Standards on Internal Audit में बहुत स्वागत है. Honorable Chairman CA Charanjot Singh Nanda जी, Chairman IASB ICAI, और उनका बहुत धन्यवाद जिन्होंने हमें मौका दिया हमें आज का वेबिनार होस्ट करने के लिए. सर आपका बहुत स्वागत है सर. And Honorable Vice Chairman CA Anil S Bhandari जी, IASB ICAI in absentia, उनका भी बहुत स्वागत है. हमारे आज के गेस्ट स्पीकर CA भरत गर्ग जी and CA साकेत मेहरा जी, who will join in later period, उनका भी बहुत स्वागत है. They both have the tremendous knowledge in his field. Bharat sir is from Sonipat ICAI only, so वो तो local ही हैं, उनका भी बहुत स्वागत है sir, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Suresh ji, for introducing all the faculty members. Now, I would like Nandaji to kindly present his keynote address.
Thank you, Parul. Thank you. It's a great honor to be the chairman of this board, which is passionately involved in ensuring that the membership at large gets the best of the services and they're able to technically hone their skills. Give me a second. I'm just going to put in my PPT. Hold for a second. So, ladies and gentlemen, is my PPT visible, Parul?
Yes, sir.
Great. So, I just told you that 72 glorious years of this profession have concluded, and we have now jumped into the 73rd year of this great profession. I would like to tell you one thing about chartered accountants. A chartered accountant is a person who, with full dedication, serves this nation. And if that has to be put by way of a couplet, it would be, Zuban kadwi hi sahi, par saaf rakhta hu. जुबान कड़वी ही सही पर साफ रखता हूं कौन कहां कब बदल गया सबका हिसाब रखता हूं. The English version is that I am very much passionately involved to ensure that transparency comes and people who have changed in whatever parameters they are, I keep a note of that. So today's session is on 200 series. 200 series is basically the standards on audit management. So standard on internal audit SIA 220, which is on conducting overall internal audit planning. So what is internal audit planning? Internal audit planning would be done in such a manner that all the business processes are reviewed by internal audit function. The entire control environment has to be enshrined by the internal auditor. So while planning, appropriate consideration is made and adequate balance is ensured to the following to ensure that we have the best risk underlying the business process. Very, very important. Risk is very important. Risk mitigation is very important, and you need to put in risk if you want to create reward out of it. Value that the internal audit can provide to the organization. Yes, internal audit essentially is a management function to add value to the perspectives of the management. Effort involved in conducting the internal audit of a particular business process. You need to quantify that effort. You need to synchronize the effort with different participants so that the best result is given. Risk appetite of the organization, which is essentially taken by the board or the audit committee and communicated to the auditor. Coverage of all auditable areas within the defined time range. Yes, the scope needs to be essentially put across. Now, what does SIA 220 say? It says that the planning exercise should be a laid down process, the outcome of which shall be a written document on audit planning, which is the important part of the principles laid down for audit. The second, the overall internal plan shall be reviewed and approved. You give it to the highest governing body, which is responsible for internal audits. They shall review and approve the audit plan, which is very, very important. Knowledge of the entity, its business, and operating environment shall be undertaken to determine the types of audit assignment which could be conducted. You are aware there is one standard on auditing which says knowing your client's business. Very, very important. Then an audit universe shall be prepared prior to establishing the scope of overall internal audit plan. An audit universe which shall show you the right direction in which whatever areas need to be audited. A risk-based planning exercise shall form the basis of the overall internal audit plan. Very, very important. The risk-based planning exercise. And then the audit universe and the overall internal audit plan shall be continuously monitored. That has to be perpetually looked into during the execution phase for achievement of the objective and to identify any deviations. The basic purpose of internal auditor is to ensure that we give the best to the management. It is an internal audit function and we are responsible to the board or to the audit committee, and therefore a total perpetual monitoring of the entire thing is important. Now, standards on audit SIA 210, managing the internal audit function. What is managing internal audit function? It includes various activities. Number one, understanding stakeholders' expectation. Yes, the internal auditor needs to balance the stakeholders' expectation in the best interest of the organization. Going ahead, even regulators and government also needs to be factored in. Second, formalized terms of engagement. Very, very important. You have to develop the vision, mission statements, and internal audit manuals so that you are able to effectively conduct the audit and give the best of the services to the entity. Audit plan. Audit plan has to be strategic as well as tactical. It has to follow all plans which needs to be determined. A resource assessing and management. Very, very important. You have to build a value-based function with the right resourcing and a strong, competent team which has the required skill sets. Very, very important. Track performance. Yes, you need to engage resources, focus on risk that matter to the organization, implement risk-based audit process. Now, times have changed from normal internal audit to risk-based internal audit, wherein all facets of risk are immediately brought to the note of the management. Formalize conclusions. Very, very important. You need to formalize the conclusions and communicate them effectively with all stakeholders, the board and the audit committee. You are aware that Chief Internal Auditor, CIA, is also responsible for managing internal audit function. Now, SA 210, managing the internal audit function. This standard primarily deals with the responsibility of the CIA or a person who has been assigned to coordinate and manage the overall performance of activities related to internal audit. Now, what does it do? Number one, the achievement of overall objectives of internal audit. Yes, the internal audit engagement letter or audit charter determines what is the overall objective of the internal audit. Adequate skilled resources and expertise are in place so that they're able to effectively ensure that the issues of the management are timely addressed. Internal audit assignments are undertaken in a systematic, disciplined, and professional manner. Very important to give the best. Quality of the work performed. Quality standards are the mother standards. They have to be put this into account. Quality of the work performed forms a sound basis for reporting and is supported by evidence and documentation. Evidence and documentation is very, very important. Work is conducted in information with the standards of internal audit and other related pronouncements issued by ICAI. So largely the purpose is to ensure that the man who is at the helm of affairs, the man who is in charge of internal audit, ensures that the entire plan is drawn in such a fashion that results are effectively given. So, ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to the end of my keynote address. Over to Madam Parul Agarwal for further proceedings. Madam, the dice is all yours.
Thank you, Nandaji. Definitely, you have given us the brief of today's event and how we are going to move forward. So now I would like to invite our first speaker. Before that, I would like to mention about few of his achievement. Mr. CA Bharat Garg. Bharatji is a CNCS with over 18 years of experience in internal audits, process and compliance reviews, investigations, operational risk management, and revenue assurance. He is also a certified internal auditor and currently pursuing CISA certification. His exposure spans across all the three sectors: consulting, private, and public. Previously, he has worked in reputed organizations like Deloitte, PwC, Vodafone, RBS, etc., and have got diverse exposure in multiple industries like BFSI, telecom, manufacturing, and FMCG. Mr. Garg is currently working as Head of Audit, Fidelity International, India. Mr. Garg is associated with Institute of Internal Auditors, Delhi Chapter, and IIA, India, as Secretary and Board Member, respectively, and also volunteering as Chairman of Publications and Media Committee of IIA, India, which publishes a monthly digital magazine, Internal Auditor Today. Understanding his experience, we would like to hear how to strategize the planning to conduct internal audit, and certainly as Nandaji has provided with his PPT regarding the how to review the business processes, the risk, how to calculate, how to assess the risk appetite, and the efforts involved to plan the internal audit. So over to you, sir.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks, Parul, for the introduction. Thank you, Sarash, Nandaji, and ISP for giving me this opportunity. It's really a great pleasure for me. And as Sarash briefly mentioned, so I got an opportunity to share my perspective on few of the ICA programs earlier, thanks to Nandaji, but this one is pretty special for me. I didn't know that it's hosted by Sonipat chapter of ICAI, which happens to be my home branch as well, my native town. So this is really special for me. Thank you, Nandaji, once again. And also thanks, for providing a brief overview of my today's topic, conducting overall internal audit planning. You have already provided a bird's view, and I'll try, to provide some additional details around it. As we all know that well begun and well planned is half done. So this particular internal audit standard, I would say, if complied with properly, this will help help in going a long way in achievement of the IA objectives. With this, I'll share my screen, the presentation for today's. So today's topic is conducting overall internal audit planning. SIA 220. I'll be dividing the entire session or next 45 minutes into two broad uh, areas. So one will be bit theoretical as to, what does SIA says in terms of introduction, what are the key elements, the scope of the SIA, the objectives of SIA, and the planning process, which will entail the considerations for the audit planning and also the documentation requirements. Subsequently, I'll spend some time on taking you through some of the practical examples. And I'm happy to take questions at the end, but program organizers have advised that all the questions will be taken post completion of second session after Saket Mera session. So, okay. Now, internal audit planning, as the name suggests, there are two broad type of internal audit planning. So one is the internal audit plan for a particular period. It may be a financial period, it may be a year, it may be, depending on the organization. This is for the entire entity, and this is something which is approved by the those which are charged with governance. So it could be the board or the audit committee, and this forms the scope of the current SIA 220. This is also called as annual audit plan in normal parlance. The other planning is specific to an IA assignment. So it is with respect to a specific audit. It could be HR audit, finance audit, and wherein, we do a planning and ascertain the scope, the limitations with respect to a specific internal audit assignment. That is dealt with a separate standard on internal audit, SIA 310. In terms of statutory requirements, as we all are aware, the audit committee of the company or the board shall, in consultation with the internal auditor, is required to formulate the scope, the functioning, the periodicity, and the audit methodology for conducting the internal audit. This is mandated by the Companies Act. I do appreciate that this is applicable for listed companies, and in case of other unlisted and privately held companies, this is subject to certain thresholds in terms of turnover. It could be deposits, bank borrowings, and share capital. However, in all the companies wherein internal audit function is established, typically the internal audit plan is approved by the audit committee or the board. Sorry. Key elements. SIA defines that the overall internal audit plan, it should be comprehensive. It need to encompass the entire entity and its operations. And second aspect is it is directional in nature. So these two are quite interrelated. So think of a large diversified MNC which have multiple businesses, multiple legal entities incorporated in multiple countries. They have operations in multiple geographies and regions. There might be a lot of third-party material outsourcing arrangements. So this internal audit plan, it encompasses all of it. It ensures that it provides an overview and it considers all of those aspects or auditable entities. The third aspect is timing. Beginning of the plan period, it need to be prepared at the beginning of the plan period. The standard mentions year, and it may be depending on the organization. Though I appreciate that it may be true few years back, but considering that we live in a very dynamic world, and these days not the change but speed of change is the biggest risk. So probably a 1 year timing or audit plan may not be sufficient. You need to review and continuously monitor your audit plan on a regular basis. The periodicity may be dependent upon the organization. It may be dependent upon the organization operations, its business, and other external factors. Who is responsible for preparing this internal audit plan? So it's the chief internal audit executive. And in case certain organizations have outsourced the internal audit function, then it's the engagement partner who is responsible for preparing this plan. Of course, subject to the audit engagement requirements. The final outcome will be in the form of an overall internal audit plan, which will lift down the audits or audit assignments or consulting projects, which will be taken care of during the plan period. In case it's an outsourced internal audit function, it may be called as audit engagement plan. Scope, quite self-explanatory. It deals with the internal audit's responsibility to prepare the overall IA plan. And in case it's outsourcing, then it is applicable only to the outsourced part of the engagement. Objectives. There are 5 objectives which are listed in this particular standard. So the first one, very important, the audit plan is in line with the audit charter, objectives of the IA function, and overall organization. This is important to ensure that whatever purpose and the objectives are listed for the internal audit function in the audit charter, they are fulfilled by this audit plan. Alignment with the organization risk assessment. So another important factor while we formulate the internal audit plan is consideration of the risk management framework. How robust are the risk management activities? What's the risk appetite of the organization? What's the risk culture within the organization? So all of this will have a bearing on how we formulate our internal audit plan. I give an example from my organization. Of course, it's a banking and financial services organization. We are an asset manager selling funds, and we have a robust and fully mature 3 lines model. So we make sure that during our annual or periodic internal audit planning exercise, we leverage upon the work being done by the first line and the second line risk teams. In fact, there are many other oversight groups in large financial organizations. So it could be the compliance team, the third party oversights, risk teams, first line risk teams. So all of that is being considered. Next is broad scope, methodology, depth of coverage with those is confirmed, agreed with those charged with governance. So this is very important. Since we are talking about the internal audit plan for the entire year or for the period, and this has to be in line with the audit charter and objectives of IA function, it need to be approved by those charged with governance. As we all know that audit charter is also approved, by those charged with governance. It could be board or audit committee. In terms of what's the authority, what's the responsibility of the internal audit. So this is important that audit plan is also approved by same set of governance forums. Next is overall resources. We all know resources are always a constraint, and resources are never a luxury. We would like to put our resources onto the most riskiest areas. It has to be a risk-based audit plan. We also need to be mindful of the fact while formulating audit plan that our resources are quite skilled. They possess the necessary skills, qualifications to carry out specific audits. As we know, new technologies are emerging on a regular basis. So the resource skill sets need to be evaluated. In addition, it's also about the availability of the resources. So neither the resources should be overburdened, because then the audit risk may be quite high. There may be a risk of corners being cut. And second aspect would be that neither it should be that the resources are not deployed appropriately. And last, quite specific, and in fact I should say it's very generic, the audits whatever are to be undertaken in line with the internal audit plan, they need to conform with all the applicable pronouncements of ICAI. Well, as of now, we all know the SIAs are recommendatory in nature. They are yet to be made mandatory, but it need to conform with the applicable pronouncements. Okay. In terms of key considerations, so this is the overall planning process. We'll be spending quite some time on this particular slide. If I talk about SIA, so there is a quite lot of information which is being provided, but I have tried to put it in a very concise manner. The image on the right hand side, so this is basically a snapshot of how we do it in our organization, and there are a couple of more slides towards the end wherein I'll be talking through it in more detail. But overall, in terms of the key considerations, as we know that audit is quite subjective, so the standards specify that the internal auditor or chief audit executive, whosoever is responsible for overall internal audit planning, should be using the professional judgment, which is quite self-explanatory. And more importantly, the organization should have a well documented planning process. The planning process should talk about what are the key inputs, what will be the info sources, where from information will be gathered, how risk assessment will be performed for the purpose of internal audit, how it will be approved, and what will be the final output, how it will look like, all of it. The entire planning process, it need to be documented. In terms of key considerations, knowledge of the business, again, quite important. In fact, if I think of all of these key considerations listed over here, knowledge of the business probably will be on the top. We need to understand, uh, what is our business, what is the business model, what are the key challenges within the business, what are the various nuances, operational complexities, what are the challenges, what is the business environment in which business operates. So all of this is essential to gain an understanding of the overall audit universe. Next is management stakeholder discussions. Of course, over a period of time, while working with the organization or in similar industries, an internal auditor gets more and more understanding of the business. But the management stakeholder discussions are quite helpful in helping us understand the business. So these discussions should be quite comprehensive, and they shouldn't be constrained only to the highest level. In fact, we should be percolating to the lowest level, having these kind of discussions to understand more about the business at a process level, risk level, all of it. And this also gives us an opportunity to understand more about the management's expectation, what are the challenges or the risks they are facing, any particular activity which they would like us to perform, or wherein they are facing challenges they would like more assurance or hand holding, whatever. So this gives us a sneak peek view into all of those areas. Audit universe. So audit universe is a term which defines basically all the conceivable audit assignments within a particular organization, and this will form the basis of our risk-based planning exercise and the audit plan. So basis the info which would have got from understanding the business and management stakeholder discussions, you would come up with the audit universe. I'll spend some more time in while I'll be talking through my organization example on audit universe and risk-based planning exercise. So I'm leaving risk-based planning as of now. Next is technology deployment. Again, very, very important. These days, most of the businesses, they are driven by the technology. So it's very imperative for an internal auditor to understand the technology or IT landscape, how the how the network is established. Are there more number of in-house developed applications or third-party applications? Are they hosted on premise or on cloud? Or how is the network configured? Is it staggered or is it quite consolidated? So all of those things need to be understood and while formulating an internal audit plan, because they have a bearing on how do we provide assurance. Resource availability, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to understand what are the available resources, what are their skill sets before we start allocating it and formulating an internal audit plan for a particular period. Regulatory statutory expectations. Now, this is quite specific, and this is not with respect to the regulatory or the statutory obligations or expectations which are to be met by the business. So, for example, it won't be as simple as like the requirements of Companies Act or the various labor acts or various fiscal laws, but basically herein we mean the regulatory and statutory expectations from the internal audit function. So like there are many geographies which have specific obligations for an internal auditor. Even in India, now the CARO is applicable, and there is now basically, those two aspects have been reintroduced, which requires is the internal audit function commensurate with the size and operations of the company, and has stat auditor reviewed the internal audit reports. So there are certain expectations which are to be dealt with, and those the internal auditor need to be aware of all of these. Approval, as I mentioned earlier, the overall internal audit plan is to be approved by the board or the audit committee. In case there are certain limitations with respect to the internal audit plan, be it because of the budgetary constraints, be it because of travel constraints, as in the current COVID period, or because of lack of skill set, or some other operational challenges, all of those need to be communicated to the board or audit committee. Continuous monitoring. Excuse me. Continuous monitoring. As I mentioned, we live in a very dynamic world, and there are new challenges, new risks which are emerging on a continuous basis. So it's important that we review the output of overall internal audit planning on a periodic basis to make sure if there are any plan changes which are required. Moving on to next, documentation. The standard is quite specific in terms of as to what are the documentation requirements, and to ensure that there is proper trail and all of the inputs and the risk assessment and the output, how it is being derived, is being available for future reference. There are few things which are specifically to be documented. So all the information which is collected from with respect to the business, the summary of meetings with key stakeholders, the risk assessment documentation, the way the risk assessment has been performed, audit universe, how does it look like, what are the total number of audit assignments, the summary of auditable units, a brief summary of each of them, resource plan, availability, skill set, and of course the final overall internal audit plan, which will list down all the audit assignments which need to be conducted in a particular period. In terms of the image, so the output will be audit. We'll start with basically audit universe and auditable entities. I'll assume that the knowledge of the business and management stakeholder discussions, they are continuing in nature. So there will be a risk assessment which will be performed, and subsequently the residual risk for each of those risk audit entities, consideration of reg stat requirements, resources, management request, they all are considered to come up with an internal audit plan. I'll share some more details with respect to my organization. So this is a snapshot of how we can perform periodic audit plan in our organization. So I come from Fidelity International, which is an asset manager. We basically sell funds, mutual funds. We sell our own mutual funds and third-party mutual funds to a host of clients. It could be a direct retail client, it could be a institutional client, and or it could be a tech sector, something like ATC, investments under ATC, or it could be for pensions and retirees, something like NPS. And because of all of these multiple type of clients, there are multiple nuances and multiple applicable regulatory obligations. And being in BFSI, we have a very robust 3 lines model. Now, how we have done is that at the top, as you can see, these are the auditable businesses. This is just an example. So I've still segregated technology, support functions. It could be something like finance, HR, corporate services, administration, procurement, and some BFSI specific anti-money laundering, those kind of stuff. And these are, the normal business units, 1, 2, and all of it. How we have derived it is, so this is mirroring the entire organization. So we have a chief executive officer, and then we have the chief executive officer minus one level, which is basically, the head of these functions, head of technology, head of HR, those kind of stuff. So these auditable businesses, they mirror the overall organizational chart. Broadly, we have around 10, and our overall audit universe, it has got 3 levels. So at level 1, we have got the high level functions, which is like technology, finance, HR, and other functions, around 10 of them. At level 2, we have further bifurcated these functions at a more granular level. I'll take some industry agnostic examples. Say, for example, HR. So at level 2, HR will be bifurcated into uh, talent acquisition and development. It would be, reward and compensation. It would be payroll processing, and it would be, HR systems and other miscellaneous things. So HR will be at level 1, and at level 2 there will be 4 audit entities. Now level 3 is more at a specific level. Again, I'll pick another example. So within HR, we had 4 levels. One of them was HR payroll. Now, since it's a multinational, we operate in more than 28 countries, more largely in UK, continental Europe, APAC. So at level 3, the payroll would be something like UK payroll, India payroll, continental Europe payroll, APAC payroll, depending on the number of employees and depending on, host of other factors. There is one level 4 as well in case it's required, and there is also a mapping to the countries. So like continental Europe payroll, it may be processed, or it may be, being done out of India, it may be done out of Paris and Germany. So there will be countries mapped to it. So this will give us an assurance that all the entire business units, they are being covered in my audit universe. So picture it something like this. We have 10 broad level 1 entities. One of them is HR. At level 2, we have 4 of them. The key functions of HR. At level 3, one of the key functions is further bifurcated, and it's now at a regional level. And level 4 is, the countries or where the processes are being located. So that's how it works. This basically ensures that our audit universe is quite comprehensive. It encompasses all the business units, encompasses all the legal entities, all the functions, and at times there may be a specific requirement to cover, certain risks as well. Say, for example, certain risks which are quite generic in nature and which cut across legal entities. Say, for example, social media risk or anti-money laundering. So that is something which will cut across all of these businesses, across all 28 countries and all the businesses. So there may be a separate line item at level 2 for it. We have around 100 odd line items at level 2. The risk assessment is being done at level 2. So I'll not be assessing HR. I'll be assessing, HR payroll. I'll be assessing, HR talent acquisition and development separately. Where from do I get the information? So these are some of the examples which I have quoted where from we get the information. Statutory regulatory requirements. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is not with respect to the business, but basically, this is with respect to the business. So the statutory regulatory requirements for the business, this particular one, I'll come to the other one later on. The risk assessments. The risk assessments at this level and the risk assessment mentioned over here, these two are quite different. This risk assessment is more granular, and since we follow 3 lines defense model, this is being done by the businesses in coordination with second line. This risk assessment, the broader risk assessment, this is being done by internal audit by considering the output of risk assessment done by businesses. So the risk assessment done by businesses will be quite detailed, and it will consider all the inherent risks and the controls within a particular process. It will be very, very granular in nature, but this will be very high level. Management information. Of course, another important factor in terms of assessing the risk. So we get hold of management information for all the key processes to understand as to what are the key factors, key KPIs, key KRIs which are being tracked by the management. What is important from them? What are their key challenges? So this is an important input to gain information about it. Projects. So any large organization would have large number of projects. It could be new system implementation or new product launches. In fact, moving into new geographies, and all of them comes with a lot of challenges. So typically what we do is that we lift all the key projects running within the organization, and for all the key ones there would be at least one internal audit spoke who will sit on the either the steer co or the executive committee as a silent observer. So we do understand how the project is moving, and what are the risks associated with the project. Management stakeholder discussions, quite generic. Tech incidents, risk events. So uh, we have a very comprehensive system of logging all the tech incidents, the risk events, the compliance breaches. I have not listed, but even the customer complaints. So all of them are good source of information to do a proper risk assessment about a particular area and understand as to what may go wrong, what is the risk, how risky is the process. Industry info. So not for all the areas, but definitely for some of the key audit entities, we do scan and understand how the industry is behaving. Say for example, recently one of the very large private sector banks in India was in the news for wrong reasons in terms of frequent network outages. So that is one input for me, while I am framing the internal audit plan for a bank in India, to understand if I need to look specifically into my IT landscape. So this is just one example. Or certain bank is again in the news for AML related non-compliances or sanction screening related non-compliances. So that may be input for me to understand in if my AML related processes and governance, they are riskier or not. Risk governance forum packs. Uh, so this again is a important source of information in terms of understanding as to what are the key projects, what are the key challenges, how the information, the executive operational information is flowing to the top to the various risk and the governance forums. Other external oversight. Herein I went by others, I meant the audits or the risk reviews which are being performed by first line, something like finance teams, in India, they check the effectiveness of internal controls of financial reporting. So you can leverage on that. The reviews being undertaken by the compliance teams or by the risk teams, first line or second line. External oversight in certain geographies, there may be certain external audit requirements, not the stat audit, but other external audit, something like SOC type 1, type 2 kind of reports, and open and known issues. So this again help us gain an understanding over the overall area. So considering all of this information, in fact, this is this overall internal audit planning. This is quite a mammoth exercise in our organization. We spent close to 1 month on an annual basis, and majority part of it, spent in August, September quarter 3 when we start planning for the next year, and then this is further refreshed in first quarter of the next year in case there are any changes which are required. So the information is collated from all of these sources, and then there is a excuse me, and then that information is being used to populate all of these factors. So as you can see, these are the inherent risk factors, these are the control environment risk factors. All the information collated is being used to understand as to what are the status of risk assessment, risk event, size, complexity of change. So these are some of the areas wherein we capture that information, and each of these parameters, there is an assigned score to it. Basis these scores, so it could be, high, medium, low, 1 to 5, whatever suits the organization. And basis that, we come up with an inherent risk score for each of those audit entities, like HR, payroll we were talking about. Similarly, we consider these key control environment factors. Again, a score to assign. So say, for example, if there is a significant attrition happening in a particular, business unit, or some of the people with the SME knowledge or long tenured, they have left the organization. So it is basically an indicator of weakness in the control environment. Whether it will weaken or not, so that's quite subjective. And of course, the internal auditor doing the planning need to take a call. Open issues, governance, first line risk, how robust is the first line risk, whether they are frequent reporting of all the risk events, all the compliance breaches, tech incidents, whether it's frequently discussed, reaching out to the right stakeholders, all of it. So this is being populated in all of these parameters. And then it basically provides us the residual risk. So consideration of inherent and the control environment factors, we come up with a residual risk. So there will be a score which will be assigned to each of those 100 odd audit entities which are risk assessed. Now, once we have identified that these are my 100 audit entities, and this is the risk score, the next is to formulate an audit plan, which I'll be doing for the next year. Definitely, it may not be worthwhile. Neither I have the luxury of unlimited resources to ensure 100% of the audit universe is being done in a year. So I need to be pragmatic. How we do is so on the one hand side, we have all the audit entities along with the residual risk scores. On the other hand side, I have my resource plan, which lifts down the resources which are available, their skill set. And the third factor is, herein again I'll call out the statutory regulatory obligations for internal audit. So if I know there are certain audits which anyways I have to do on an annual basis because of a regulatory requirement in Hong Kong or in Singapore, I need to assign my resources to it. Whether it is a low risk, whether it is a medium risk or a high risk, irrespective of the fact, it's a regulatory requirement, I need to adhere to it. So first of all the resources, whatever are required for those regulatory requirements or regulatory audits, let's put it that way, those regulatory audits that are assigned to it. Next, we pick up the audit entities which has got the highest residual risk. So we follow a model wherein we envisage that all the entities with the residual risk of high residual risk need to be audited on an annual basis. Something like, let's say, information security. Quite obvious. Then audit entities which have a medium residual risk, those may be audited once in 2 years or even 3 years, depending on the availability of resources. And the audit entities which are with a low residual risk rating, those may be via various monitoring of management information, risk governance forums, management stakeholder meetings. And of course, since there will be a continuous monitoring, they can always come on the job. So this is how we come up with an audit plan. And subsequently, it's presented to the audit committee, and along with any limitations pertaining to the plan. Once it's finalized, it's communicated, or basically, it's communicated to all the stakeholders. So this is about the periodic audit planning. The periodic monitoring, quite similar, but this is at a very high level. Sorry. The audit planning is done at level 2. Remember, I spoke about 100 odd audit entities. But periodic monitoring is being done at level 1, around 10 of them. So I'll be monitoring if there are any significant changes in technology in last 3 months or 6 months, whatever period I would have chosen for monitoring. I do the entire exercise once again, fill in and populate all of these parameters information, understand how the risk scoring for those level, the underlying level 2 business entities have moved, up, down? Or it has remained constant? What has happened? Have new regulations come in? Has operational complexity increased? Whether there have been changes in the organizational structure? So whatever it could be. And then we come up in case these changes require a change to the audit plan. If yes, then of course you need to go back to the audit committee to get those changes approved, find resources for those for completing those assignments. So this is how we complete our periodic monitoring. I'm happy to answer your questions, but maybe we can take it after Saket's session. Thank you. Over to you, Parul.
Thank you, Bharatji, for such a good, insightful session. We certainly had learned so much information from you, and definitely your session has helped us understanding how to prepare an audit plan. For the foremost, how to before even analyzing, formatting the audit plan, we need to gain the knowledge of the business, thereby and identifying the resource, the skill resource, and uh, and how much comprehensive you can make the audit plan by by mentioning the timing, responsibility, outcome. Thereby, you also presented us a sample of the audit plan that could be really helpful for the young chartered accountants, and also how to align the audit plan, taking into account the business risk of the business, and and the most important part, how to document each and every step, be it business information, all the meeting conduct with with the business enterprises, uh, and so on. So thank you so much, Mr. Bharatji, for providing such an insightful session. Now, I would introduce our next speaker, Mr. Saket Mehra ji, who will be giving his session on standard of internal audit on 210 on managing the internal audit functions. Before giving the mic to Mr. Mehra ji, I would like to present his experience. In a career spanning of 18 years, Mr. Mehra ji has led several advisory engagements around internal audits, enterprise risk management, corporate governance, and forensic reviews across varied industries, etc. He has advised corporates on effectively improving the internal control environment through continuous control monitoring using advanced data analytics, as well as through frameworks like SOX, JSOX, internal financial controls, ERM, etc. Mr. Mehra currently leads the auto practice for the firm and has been actively involved with industry bodies including ACMA, IOD, IIA, CII, and ASSOCHAM. He is Vice President for IIA New Delhi chapter and is also a member of the ICAI's Internal Audit Standard Board Subcommittee for Revision of Internal Audit Standards. During the course of his career, Mr. Mehra ji has developed an expertise in the manufacturing and infrastructure sectors with a particular emphasis on automobiles, where he has advised clients on cross-border acquisitions, corporate restructuring, internal audits, and internal controls. In his professional experience, he has led forensic investigation as well as advised clients in FCPA compliance and UK Bribery Act compliance requirement. His total experience is in the way he has his experience in various sectors, including automotive, utilities, infrastructure, real estate, technology. Over to you. We are glad to have you, Mr. Mehra ji. Over to you now, please.
Thank you, Parul. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Great. Very good evening to all the fellow members. First of all, many congratulations for the Sonipat branch to organize this event. It's a pleasure to be with all of you over here. I hope everyone is keeping safe in these times. Thank you, Nandaji. Thank you, Mr. Anil Bhandari-ji, CA Saransh Jain, my fellow colleague Bharat, whom we just heard. He gave an excellent overview on planning the internal audit activity. What I'll be now talking about is once the audit planning is completed, how do we take it forward? Planning is the utmost important aspect when we talk about any engagement, be it internal audit, be it stat audit. And then it comes equally important about how do we manage what has been planned? How do we make sure that, yes, we don't go off the plan? What are those requirements which need to be taken into consideration at the planning stage, as well as in terms of managing or making sure that our planning is intact during the course of the engagement and even after the engagement? So that is what I would be picking up, in my session over the next half an hour, 45 minutes. But before I do so, I would like to congratulate all my fellow colleagues for the CA Day that we just celebrated yesterday. It's a proud moment for all of us that we could celebrate the 73rd CA Day yesterday. I think as a fraternity, we stand together, and in the difficult times that we all saw over the last couple of months, CA community has really come forward, helping its members, in terms of making sure that, yes, all of us come out of these difficult situations together. So a commendable job by the entire fraternity, and many congratulations to the different committees, different people, different members who actually did it for all of us. So what I'll do is I have a small presentation which I would be running, but before I do so, is that visible, Parul?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Visible.
Yeah. So before I do that, I think just taking forward from Bharat just talked about on the planning stage, I think there are very important aspects which Bharat touched upon, which is in terms of the risk assessment, which is also in terms of devising some kind of an audit plan. And this is important because if we go wrong at the stage of planning the audits, then in most of the times I have seen in my experience, in my professional experience, that we will also go wrong somewhere in terms of the audit execution. And audit execution, audit management, audit review, there are many things which potentially can go wrong if we don't really plan our audits in a much organized manner. Bharat also talked about the aspects which need to be taken into consideration while planning an audit. If we are planning an audit for an organization which has operations only in India, vis-a-vis an organization which has global operations, the planning would certainly differ. The risk thresholds which need to be considered for the Indian operations, for the global operations, are different. The complexities involved in the Indian operations and the global operations are different. And I think these are the aspects which have to be taken into consideration at the planning stage, which Bharat talked about. So what I will now be talking about largely is, the SIA 210, which is more in terms of managing the audit function. We will try to understand what are the objectives, what is the background, for having this as a standard, and then what are the key requirements, what are the key expectations from us as members, or even the non-members who are practicing internal audit from this particular standard. Before I move on to my subsequent slides, there are also some basic aspects which I thought I'll just try to bring it to the forum. And it may not be really related to this particular standard, but it is very important. It is very important to refresh or realize the importance of those two aspects which I'm going to talk about, because those aspects really hold true whether we perform an internal audit or we perform an statutory audit for our clients. And these two aspects are more about independence and objectivity. How independent we are and how objective we are is something which is determined not only by the nature of work that we are doing, but also the authority and the responsibility that we are exercising in discharging our duties. As an auditor, as an internal auditor, if I'm not independent, and independence means that yes, I should have the ability, the authority, or the access to the senior most management in the organization. Now, if I don't have that kind of an access, if I'm unable to, speak to the highest level in an organization, I may not really remain independent in discharging my duties as an auditor. So that's a given expectation when we talk about any auditor. Independence also means that yes, we are not getting biased anyway. We are not getting carried away by any aspect in the organization. This is something which has to be embedded, in our day-to-day working when we discharge our duties for our clients. Many times we have seen that yes, independence does get compromised, objectivity also gets compromised, and in true sense, we may not be regarded as the right set of stakeholders to disclose to the external world as to what really the state of affairs of an organization are. And if you pick up any news articles over the last few years, you will see that many such situations have emerged, wherein the auditors have been found to be negligent, have been found to be guilty, and that's where I thought I'll just bring this point, that why it is so important to be independent and objective in performing our internal audit function. Well, moving on, if we broadly look at from an internal audit point of view, I'm just trying to carry forward what Bharat talked about, largely from a point of scoping an internal audit program or an internal audit plan. Let's say if there is an organization which is a manufacturing organization, which manufactures products, which sells the products through its customers, through its distributors to the end customers. The manufacturing operations does involve aspects around how do I source, what raw material do I source, what indirect materials do I source, how do I inventorize those items which I'm sourcing. It also talks about what are my core production operations. It talks about what are my revenue procedures. It talks about how do I collect the money from the customers. How do I engage with the distributors, with the transporters? How do I make sure that yes, my plant operations are up and running and there is a regular maintenance? How do I make sure that yes, I have adequate amount of controls built up in my product costing, so that the products which I'm eventually selling to my customers is something which is not being sold at a negative contribution. So all these aspects are purely operational in nature, which any which ways become part of the internal audit plan when we talk about, let's say, a manufacturing organization. Similarly, if you look at in any organization, there are also support functions. So a finance team may not be directly interacting with the vendors. They may not be directly interacting with the customers, but they are the people. It is said that yes, we are the lifeline of any organization, the finance team. So, but that's support function, but a very, very important function. Human resource, again, a very important function. That's the function who kind of takes care of the employees, their joining, their resignation procedures, evaluation, performance improvement procedures, etc. Then there are corporate operations which take place at the corporate office. There are also aspects around legal compliances, regulatory compliances, secretarial compliances. Now, if you look at this entire value chain, this is typically what forms part of the internal audit. What normally doesn't get form part of the internal audit is more of a strategic aspects. How the company is getting into joint ventures. Am I doing a joint venture with the right partner? Have I performed the right set of diligence on my joint venture partner? Or if there is an acquisition happening, am I actually acquiring the right set of organization? That's where typically the internal auditors do not include those areas as part of the audit scope. But yes, gradually what we are seeing that internal auditors have been doing something like more of a value addition to their clients, to the organizations where they belong to, in helping their clients or maybe the management take an effective decision. Now, why this is important, why I'm trying to emphasize on these aspects, is because once we have an audit plan put in place, once a risk assessment has been done, once the areas have been identified which needs much focused attention, then how do we make sure that yes, we carry out or we perform the audit procedures in a manner which become much more effective, which are efficient enough, and also there is adequate amount of communication which happens to the right stakeholders. And at the same time, I need to be independent, I need to be objective while performing my procedures. So with this background now, what I'll be largely talking about is what are those key aspects which an internal auditor needs to take into consideration for the purpose of managing well the internal audit function. So I thought I'll just give or start with this kind of a background that typically as an internal auditor, we are required to look at these different aspects, typically in a manufacturing organization. Similarly, in a service organization, there may not be any production related aspects. There not be anything like around repairs and maintenance. But then there are other aspects which need to be taken into consideration as far as the audit planning or the audit scoping is concerned. Now, let me just briefly talk about a few aspects which again need to be considered. Broadly, if I look at, when I talk about how do I manage my internal audit function, the management of the internal audit function or the activity starts right from the planning stage, which we have discussed. How do we make sure that yes, there is adequate amount of monitoring which happens? That's the other aspect which we'll be deliberating upon, which I'll be kind of talking more about it. How do we make sure that yes, the people who are part of our teams, whether I'm doing an audit for my client or am I part of an organization heading their internal audit function or maybe a part of the internal audit team, how do I make sure that yes, the people who are working with me, I also groom them, I also make them undergo some kind of a training and development, and I also make them grow along with the organization. That is something which may not directly be impacting my work, but it in an indirect manner impacts my work to a very large extent. And it becomes a very integral part of managing the internal audit activity or the internal audit function. The other aspect that I'll be talking about is how do I make sure that yes, my internal audit activity, my internal audit team has got the right set of experts available to undertake different audits. These days, as Bharat was also talking about, technology is playing a big role in our lives, in the lives of our clients also. Be it a client in the manufacturing sector, be it a client in the financial services sector, be it a client in the real estate sector, everywhere technology is playing a significant role, not only bringing out efficiency of operations, but also bringing us closer to our customers. So something like a customer relationship management becomes so important, and which cannot happen or which is too difficult to manage or to handle unless we have a seamless customer relationship module or an application which resides in the organization. So when it comes to looking at these aspects, when it comes to looking at aspects around customer centricity, when it comes to looking at aspects around application review, what do I do or what do I need to do as part of my internal audit team wherever I don't have the skill sets or competency to review such procedures? Do I hire them? Do I take them as an external consultant to work with me or with my team? Is the other aspect that we will talk about when it comes to managing the audit function. We will also talk about the importance of communication. Why communication is important. At what stages is the communication important? What are the modes of communication that one needs to take into consideration? These days, there are a lot of official communication which happens on the unofficial platforms. So how do we make sure that yes, our communication is seamless within the team as well as with our clients or whoever to whoever we are providing the services? And last but not the least, I will also touch upon on the quality aspects, which is like how do we make sure that yes, our audit function is governed by some quality parameters, is measured by certain quality parameters. So that's a broader outline of what I'll be talking about over the next half an hour or so. So with this, I'll just move on to individual sections as to what these individual sections typically will talk about. Now, one of the aspects when we talk about the requirements of these standards, we have understood as to what the objectives are and why this standard exists. Now let's talk about what are these requirements which I broadly touched upon in the previous slide. The first one is about the internal audit process manual. Now it may so appear that why do we really need a manual for the internal audit process? I mean, what is that an internal audit manual will talk about? But it is very much important. It is very much important because at the planning stage, when we have actually looked at when we have actually looked at the risk assessment, when we have actually identified which locations to be audited, what period to be audited, I need to have a document which talks about, which is something like as my responsibility document, something like a charter, whether we call it as a charter, which actually defines what is the authority which has been given to the internal audit function. So that particular document needs to be supported by some kind of a manual which says that what exactly is to be covered as part of this internal audit plan, which talks about that before starting the internal audit, before starting the audit for a particular function, whom do I need to communicate to? How do I design or how do I include certain escalation procedures, escalation protocols? We might have experienced that when we start an audit, 2 days, 3 days down the line, if we were to kind of ask for a set of data from the client, if we don't get that data, invariably we would tend to wait for the data to come from the clients. But can we develop a procedure? Can we develop a protocol that if we haven't got the requested information from the client beyond certain number of days or maybe number of hours, we need to escalate that. We need to go up to a next level to talk about the hindrance which is coming in performing or discharging our duties. And that is where this kind of a manual becomes very, very effective. And that is where this manual actually defines the responsibilities of not only the auditor, but also the auditee. Typically, when we complete the audit, when we execute the audit, there is something like a closure of the audit which needs to happen. Now, what has to be the process for the closure of the audit? Who typically needs to be participating in those closure meetings? How effectively are we communicating our observations to the process owners, taking their buy-in, whether through a formal sign-off or maybe some kind of an acknowledgement over an email or any other mode, is also something which becomes a procedure which needs to be captured in the internal audit manual. In my personal experience, I have seen my experience of 20 years being an internal auditor. I have seen that many a times the junior auditors typically get stuck while executing the audits, that what do I do? And very often they would go to their seniors or to their managers or to the team leaders, understanding or asking us what should be done. Now imagine if you have a internal audit manual which gives all possible scenarios, which gives all the sequence of activities which need to be undertaken it would be very useful for the junior auditors to just refer to the manual, understand the situation, and apply certain procedures. So it helps you to kind of execute the internal audit process in a very structured, in a very seamless manner. And my personal experience says that it has actually helped our teams in executing the audits in a much smoother manner. It might appear to be a bit theoretical that we do really need a manual, but it helps. In the long term, it really helps to have a documented internal audit process manual. So that's the first requirement, typically what the standard is, though it is recommendatory, but there are many instances which I can quote wherein the internal audit manual came very handy in managing a particular situation. I can also quote one example that in one of a situation, it had so happened that the team was assigned a particular audit. I think maybe it was a procurement audit to be done. The team started with the audit by speaking to certain individuals in the procurement function. And to a larger extent, they also, I would say, executed the audit. I think it was 20-30% of the work which was done. Now, somehow, the audit team did not meet the head of procurement while starting the audit. And when the head of procurement got to know that the audit is in progress and there is some amount of work which has been done, he was furious. He created issues around how come he wasn't involved as part of the initiation of the audit process. Now it was a learning. It was a learning for the team. It was a learning for all of us. And I think that's where we decided that yes, we need to lay down certain protocols that before you start an audit, you have to meet the head of the department. You have to meet the other departments which are related to that particular department. And there has to be a formal communication which needs to go out. Before starting the audit, the communication has to go, say, X days in advance. When you ask for a data, you need to give X number of days to the client or to the process owners to provide you the data. Now, imagine if those kind of things are documented, those kind of things are laid down very clearly, it makes a life easier for both the auditors as well as for the auditees. So that's the benefit I can say, which I have seen for the internal audit process manual. The other important aspect is on the resource plan. Now, imagine even if you are managing a team of an in-house audit function, or you are managing a team as an external internal auditor for your clients, you are bound to be using the resources. You are bound to be utilizing their capabilities, skill sets, competencies for execution of the audits. And there are different skill sets which each individual will have. In the internal audit profession, it's very essential to have a set of behavioral skills. It's equally important to have good communication skills. It's very much required to have writing skills. Now, all individuals may not have all the skills available with them. And that's where, as a team, you need to complement and supplement each other. So what is required to be done as part of the internal audit activity by the head of the audit is really to identify what skills, competencies really exist within the team members. There could be certain team members who are very good in using something like MS Excel. There could be some people who may not be so good in using Excel. But that doesn't mean that those resources are not needed. Maybe the resource who is not good in analytics could be good in report writing, could be good in communication skills, could be good in the choice of words which need to be picked up. So the head of the audit or the person who's managing the internal audit function has to identify the different capabilities, skill sets of the individuals and accordingly knit them up for discharging the duties of the internal audit function. It is also equally important that we effectively utilize these resources. Utilization in the sense, let's say if Mr. A is head of the audit of a particular organization, and he is, say, a 4-member team or a 5-member team. So how do you make sure that, yes, at any given point of time, all the 5 resources are optimally working on the task? It should not so happen that somebody's not being utilized, in the sense not doing any productive work, but the rest of the 4 people are working more productively. So how do you equate a balance within your team is also something which becomes very important. Similarly, if you are running a firm, or if you are part of a firm who's providing internal audit services to the clients, there also you need to make sure that, yes, the resources are utilized in a manner wherein there is no unutilized capacity. For example, you can make the people move from one account to the other account, or maybe depending upon the expertise which a person has, he can keep on doing those expertise roles from account to account or client to client. So that's the other thing that one needs to take into consideration when managing the internal audit activity. Many often we have seen that, yes, internal auditors are being asked to deliver something which is a value addition to their clients. So clients may expect, let's say if it's a real estate client, the real estate client may expect that, yes, while you are doing the audit for my organization, I want you to give me your opinion or give me your point of view as to how effectively the drawings which have been laid down at the start of the project. Let's say there is a building which was to be constructed. So the drawings which were laid down at the start of the project, vis-a-vis the actual building which has then been constructed, are there any variances? Are there any variances with respect to the steel which was supposed to be utilized in construction vis-a-vis the steel which I've actually utilized? Now, as an accountant, we can very well do a logical understanding of what had to be produced, or say what had to be consumed and what has been actually consumed. But then there are some technical aspects which play a very significant role. These drawings that I'm talking about are not the drawings on a piece of paper. These are drawings which are residing on applications. There are CAD applications which are being used in most of the real estate or the infrastructure companies. And you need experts, you need civil engineers to read those drawings, to understand those drawings, to understand the measurements which are there. Now that's where we as accountants might struggle because we are not equipped to read those drawings. So what we need to do is, if there is a requirement by the process owners or by the management or say by our clients, and if we do not have the skill sets to meet those requirements, we need to outsource those skill sets. So we need to bring in the experts from external environment. Maybe as a retainer or on a project to project basis, say a civil engineer. You hire a civil engineer who understands, who reads the CAD drawings and becomes a part of your team to deliver the internal audit activity. Now, when you do so, the responsibility to identify the resource or the responsibility to evaluate the competency of the person who's coming as an external consultant for you also resides with the internal audit function. You also need to adequately disclose to your client that this is something what we have used as an external consultant for performing the audit or for effectively performing the audit. But the eventual responsibility would still reside with you because you are the one who's going to be issuing the report to your client. So this is where resources play a very significant role, whether it is in terms of optimal utilization of the resources, training, providing training to those resources, making sure that, yes, they undergo X number of hours of training every year so that they are equipped to perform or discharge their functions effectively, or getting an external team member or a consultant to work with you is something what needs to be taken into consideration as part of managing the internal audit activity. The other important aspect within the internal audit activity is monitoring and reviewing the progress. Now, very often I have seen and I have come across in my experience also that there are reports at times which come for review, and you realize when you look at the report, you can make out there are some blatant errors, there are some obvious misses in the report, or say it is lacking the depth. There could be any issue. But if you try looking at the root cause of these aspects as to why a report is in a particular shape at a point of time, there could be multiple reasons attached to it. But in my experience, what I've seen, the fundamental reason which has resulted into a not so good report is the audit planning, is the time that we spend before starting the audit. And this is where monitoring plays a very significant role. Typically, what happens that there are people who would ask their team members to start an audit without investing or without putting time along with them to really look at the historical data of the area that is going to be audited, brainstorming within the team as to what we should focus upon, identifying what potentially could be the risk. Let me give you a small example. Let's say if you have a client which is into manufacturing of any product, let's say cell phones. Now, if you were to do an internal audit of the procurement function, unless you will spend time, you as in, I mean, whoever is a team leader or the engagement leader, or if you're doing it as an in-house activity, unless you spend time looking at what is the historical cost over the last 1 year or say 2 years, what is the mix of the raw material? I mean, in terms of what are those different components which are required to be bought to produce a cell phone, as an example. You may not really justify your audit efforts in the entire audit execution process. It did so happen that in one of a case, I remember we were about to start an audit of a client, and when the report came out, it did not have much of issues. And the reason when I analyze as to why potentially it might have happened is because the team invested too much time looking at the raw material procurement. Now, in this particular case that I'm talking about, raw material cost was almost 70% of the total cost. And the raw material cost was completely being monitored by the promoters. So you can imagine if promoters are exercising a control on the raw material cost, it is very unlikely that you will find an issue with respect to either the incorrect pricing or no different sources of raw material, because it was such an item which was available only with 1 or 2 vendors. So there wasn't anything much which could have been done into that raw material procurement. But when it came to procurement of the other items, there could have been issues with respect to how those different 20% of the balance amount of procurement was happening, how the vendors were identified, how the vendors were selected, etc. But what had happened, teams spent almost 80% of their time on that 80% or that 70 whatever percent of the raw material which was being bought, and hence there were no issues, and only just 20% of the time was spent on the other set of procurement. So it had to be vice versa. And this is where the monitoring plays a very significant role. The team leader has to direct the team as to what should be looked into, what should be focused upon, what should not be focused upon. It doesn't make sense to focus on raw material procurement if it is completely being controlled by the promoters or whoever. If you believe that, yes, based on your assessment of the organization, it is fairly controlled, doesn't make sense to focus too much onto it. Rather, put your efforts onto the areas which really need attention. So that is monitoring. And monitoring is not only at the start of the engagement. Many often I've seen that even during the course of the engagements, the monitoring dilutes for multiple reasons. Because we believe that, yes, the team is equipped to perform the procedures, and we tend to rely too much on the team. And that is where it's our duty to make sure that, yes, we take a stock, we take a dipstick review of what is being done on a regular basis. So that review procedures have to be built in this entire process. And finally, even on the closure of the audit, it is so very important that there has to be adequate amount of review which happens on the final product which is coming out. So this is largely where monitoring and review is so very important, because it becomes very, very annoying. It becomes very embarrassing situation when you take a report, let's say to the highest level, which is, say, for example, the audit committee, and the audit committee were to discover any kind of an error. Not that the errors cannot happen. It can happen by anyone. Not saying that there would be 100% or a complete accurate report in all aspects. But what are the checks and balances that we have built into the process to make sure that there is no possibility of a single error, even a typo error happening on our reports? Look at how the doctors perform the surgery. They are so very careful. They are so very concerned about each and every equipment or a scissor that they're picking up and putting it onto the body of onto the human body. So when they can be so diligent, why can't we be? Not that we are not diligent, we are diligent, but maybe we need to exercise some more amount of controls. It happened with me. I mean, I'll give you live example. Just last week in one of the audit committees, we had almost 99% completed our presentation. We were on the last slide, which had few numbers. There was a table which was given, which had rows and the columns, and there was a typo error. So on one column it was 39, the other column it had to be 39, but for some reason it was appearing as 38. And these days, as you know, most of the audit committees are happening virtually. So there was a remark by the audit committee chairman. He requested us to make the necessary change and resubmit the report, because it's virtual, it's getting recorded. So there wasn't any damage per se which was done, because everyone could make out it was a typo error, but it led to an embarrassing situation. So maybe if a more diligent review had been done much before circulating the audit report or circulating the internal audit deck to the audit committee members or to the company, we could have avoided that as a situation. But as I said, even after whatever diligent checks you may perform, there is always a possibility of an error occurring one or the other places. But the point is that as I said, what checks and balances are we putting in place to make sure that, yes, there is adequate amount of review procedures which get carried out at the start of the audit, during the course of the audit, as well as at the closure of the audit. One more important aspect which I would like now to pick up is on the quality evaluation and improvement programs. This is also which is also, I would say, one of a very important aspect as far as the SIA 210 is concerned. Because when we talk about these aspects, whether it is on account of providing adequate amount of review procedures, monitoring procedures, whether it is on account of staff upgradation, skill set upgradation. Now, unless there is a framework which designs, which communicates that what are my quality thresholds, what are those non-negotiable that I need to have as part of my internal audit function, it will not serve the purpose of those quality parameters which are required to be served. And hence, it is so very important that we identify that what are those quality parameters, at what places do I need to put those quality parameters, how do I ensure that, yes, a quality evaluation program runs. I can give examples of large listed organizations as an example, wherein they run a formal quality evaluation improvement program, or maybe they might be calling it as with a different name altogether, wherein this entire internal audit function gets evaluated either internally or externally by the experts, and then there is a report which comes out. which is more about how effectively the internal audit in an organization is being carried out. How effectively is the risk assessment as a process has been exercised by the organization? How effectively are you making sure that yes, your people are getting skilled, your people are undergoing training, your people are upskilled to meet the new age challenges? It also talks about your documentation standards. So there are ways and means in which this kind of a quality program can be demonstrated. But what is really important for us as professionals is really to put in place some kind of a program and then evaluate that program. We also have something like a peer review, which most of us are aware of. So though the standard is recommendatory, but why can't we adopt this standard in spirit? Why can't we exercise those good practices, those good pronouncements which are already existing, and build them up in our internal audit programs? So that's the other aspect which is very important in terms of how to make sure that yes, there are adequate amount of quality parameters which have been built up in discharging your duties. The other requirement, or rather say, I would say this is the fifth requirement, or the one of the last requirements of SIA 210, is on the documentation. Now, very often it has so happened that a lot of communication, as I was talking about earlier when I started with the presentation, that these days a lot of communication happen, official communication happen on the unofficial platforms. And that is where the importance of documentation comes in discharging the audit as a responsibility, or internal audit as a responsibility. And documentation is not only about documentation of your work procedures, is also documentation about the planning exercise, which we heard in the previous session. It's also the documentation of the final deliverables that we have. And equally important are the documentation related to the draft or the byproducts which emerge as part of this process. And this is also so important because these days, as you would agree, the regulators are becoming stringent day by day. The oversight by the governing bodies is becoming stringent day by day. Talk about SEBI, talk about any other regulator. They look at, they have started looking at the disclosures very, very closely. And there have been instances, and it's all there in the public domain, that how the chief internal auditors or the head of audits have also been found guilty in terms of not discharging their duties effectively. And that is where, in my view, documentation plays a very significant role, because this is where you'll be able to demonstrate as to how you discharged your duties, how you performed your duties, how much cautious were you in terms of performing the audit procedures, what were the samples, what was the population which you had, how did you pick up a particular set of sample, how did you arrive at a problem statement, how did you perform a root cause analysis. Now, if you start documenting all these aspects, it will give a fair amount of comfort to the auditees or to the stakeholders. Many often, I can talk about, we have been asked when we make our findings to the audit committees or to the boards, they are interested to know that, tell me, what was the population which existed, what were the samples that you have taken, and how you have chosen those samples. Now, imagine if you are talking about a large listed organization. If you're talking about an organization which is running into, say, $1 billion of revenues, and you were to look at an area around, say, sales incentives, which again runs into millions. To answer those questions to the board, would be very difficult unless you really understand as to what was the total incentive payout which happened, the samples which were drawn out, because it may not be possible to do 100% evaluation of a particular area unless yes you apply certain audit techniques like audit analytics, and then you frame your submission to the board in a manner which gives them that confidence that yes there is an adequacy of audit procedures which have been applied by the auditor. And that again will only happen if you have enough evidence with respect to what was looked into, how it was looked into, and what the results that you're communicating mean a lot to you. So hence, documentation becomes equally important in this entire process. The documentation typically may have different characteristics. Obviously, the document that we are talking about as an audit evidence has to be sufficient. It has to be a reliable document. So we need to be careful as to what the evidence we are talking about, from whom exactly did we get this document. Many often I have seen that the audit teams are not using the relevant documents for performing the audits. So the source document may not be so relevant. So that's a correction which needs to happen. The document by itself has to be useful for you to derive certain conclusions. Now, this is more in terms of, again, going back to the previous requirement which I was talking about on the review and the monitoring. So unless the review and monitoring is not there, you may end up choosing incorrect documents for the purpose of your audit evaluation. These days, a lot of work is being done electronically. There are a lot of reliance which is placed on the systems. We extract the reports from the systems. We perform our audit procedures. We retain our audit procedures electronically. And hence, it is equally important for us as internal auditors to understand the controls which get built up on the systems. So how the records which have been reviewed are archived, how the records which have been archived are being retrieved, how the records which have been retrieved are again archived. I mean, as an auditor, we can't remain clueless about the applications which are being used either for the documentation management system or the audit workflow management system. Now, this brings me almost to the end of this session, because we have covered the requirements. We talked about the objectives of this particular standard. I'll just take a minute or so talking about in the virtual environment, you know, when most of the audit procedures are being performed remotely, what are certain checks and balances that an auditor needs to take into consideration in managing the audit function? And I think, you know, all of us over the last 1 year or maybe more than a year now would have done some remote audits. There might have been restricted visits to the client locations. So that's where I think aspects around analytics or data analytics plays a very significant role. How do we make sure that, yes, we are able to extract the information from the client systems? What kind of access rights are we getting to the client systems for the set of information? How do we analyze that information? How do we send back the information? Many a times, or rather I would say most of the times, these communication have been happening through either emails or through the virtual calls. There are restricted physical visits which happened over the last 1.5 years, and the reporting also then happened virtually. Now, this environment created its own set of challenges, but it also equipped us to use the technology to a very large extent. It also enabled us to understand certain aspects of technology which were existing earlier as well, but somehow maybe were not used so effectively. And even, I mean, my personal view is that as we move forward, as we become much more digitally advanced, we in the sense our clients, our people, you know, people who come and join the internal audit profession, digital is going to be playing a very, very significant role. We need to upskill ourselves as to how we can perform the audits much more effectively and efficiently in discharging our duties. So just to summarize, my final concluding slide, very important to develop an internal audit plan or a manual, which gives a very threadbare understanding of how the activities need to be carried out as far as the internal audit function is concerned. You need to establish the responsibilities of the internal audit function, the responsibilities of the auditors, the equal responsibilities of the auditees at the same time, because they are also accountable to provide the data. We need to develop the resources, the skill sets and competency, and this has to be on an ongoing basis. We can't have a situation wherein we give a training to our people in 1 year, but for the next 2 years, we don't train them on anything. Regularly, continuously, we have to identify what are those aspects which need to be trained, for which they need to be trained. Fourth point, we need to have adequate measures and mechanisms around the review and monitoring of the internal audit function. And last but not the least is on the quality control mechanism. So this is what this standard broadly talks about. These are the broad requirements which the standard talks about. And my experience is, these standards truly have been made with a lot of practical insights. There's a lot of deliberation which has happened by many of the industry experts, people who have been practicing internal audit. So we should start using these standards. We should start adopting these standards, and you'll see a difference. At least I saw a difference when I was not using such or similar standards, and when we now use these standards in our day-to-day audit function. So that's all from my side. Parul, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a fruitful session. You bring out a very important characteristics that every CA must carry while conducting an audit is to be independent and being skeptic. Also, your insights on you have given insights on the importance of having of documenting the internal manual, importance of identifying the skilled and experts in the audit team, having a continuous monitoring on the processes so that the quality services are not hampered, and most importantly, the role of communication to develop relationship with the business, with the key stakeholders, so that they build up trust that how serious the auditors are with regard to the assignment. So at the last, you brought out a very important motive that a person may be known by the altitude he or she is on, but what survives a person throughout the journey is its attitude. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you both the speakers for such a wonderful sessions. Now we would move on to the questionnaire round. So I will be sharing the screen. Just a second. I hope it's visible to all of you. Is it visible?
Okay. Yes, it's visible.
So our first question is by Mr. Amit Bhadwar. It's internal audit checks and controls are subordinate to statutory audit. Nowadays, CAs are held accountable first for any suspicious activity being done at the management level, be it GST matter or any other matter under respective laws. What more steps under internal audit checks and control should be taken to immune the professionals from such instances?
Bharat, you want to take it up, or?
Yeah, Saket, please go ahead.
No, so very good question. Okay, thanks, Bharat. Very good question, Amit, and a very apt question in the current environment. I think to me, I would just try to answer it very simply, which is the point on documentation, what I talked about, the importance of documentation. Because if you have adequate documentation which talks about what are the audit procedures which you performed, how you actually pulled out the samples, how you actually analyzed the information, and how you concluded, if you're able to demonstrate those aspects to anyone, I mean any regulator or anyone who's raising the questions, I think you'll be able to justify to a very large extent on what has been done or how professionally the duties have been discharged by you as an auditor.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is by Sri Prakash Gagar. It's over to Mr. Bharat. To what extent a chief auditor should assess risk at the time of audit planning, as in the case of outsourced audits? The rationale is because the risk assessment in detail will anyways be performed while conducting ground level internal audit.
So if I've understood the question correctly, I think this is with respect to wherein the audit activity is outsourced and the audits are being done by an outsourced firm rather than, wherein the third party audits are being carried out. Okay. So in this kind of scenario, the chief auditor should, though the audits are being done by an outsourced internal audit activity, but it depends on the terms of the engagement. So if the terms of the engagement are pretty clear that the outsourced agency will also be performing the risk assessment, then it will be the responsibility of the outsourced agency. And as Saket covered into his, SIA, so basically the chief auditor will be responsible to ensure that the way the risk assessments are being performed by the outsourced agency, whether all the risks have been concerned, whether all the requisite information that has been, obtained for performing that risk assessment, whether all of it has been done or not. So basically, it will require adequate supervision from the chief internal auditor as well, because despite the fact that it's being done by an outsourced agency, the overall responsibility rests with the chief auditor.
Thank you, sir. So our next question is by Subir Kumar Siddhanta, the career growth as internal auditor.
Saket, you take it.
No, so I think if I've understood the question, which is more in terms of, the way to read it is there really a career as an internal auditor? The answer is big time. Globally as well as in India, the profession has gained a lot of respect, attention, not only from, I would say, the management of the companies, but also by the boards, by the regulators, more importantly. I think if you look at as an internal auditor, you can be if you are a part of an organization, you can contribute in many ways beyond internal audit as well, subject to certainly the standards which have been laid down with respect to what can be done and what cannot be done. But in terms of, I would say, as a value addition, the auditors these days do get consulted to in a very large extent. Whether you are an external internal auditors to an organization, or you are an internal auditor, the career options are humongous, both in India as well as outside.
And to add to what Saket mentioned, so if I take different perspective, it not in terms of the as a career, but in terms of from an organization point of view or in-house audit activity. So I would say there are multiple avenues. It's not about the career growth, but also it provides a lot of learning opportunities as well. So internal audit, I believe is one function which gets a bird's eye view of the entire organization, just like CEO. And of late, we have been experiencing that there are multiple opportunities for internal auditors to upskill themselves. If I quote an example, from within our organization, so as Saket mentioned, these days there is a lot of reliance on the IT systems. Most of the business is being driven by IT. So what we have done is, since tech resources are always in short demand, So we have been upskilling our business auditors. So all the, the basic IT audits, which were being done by IT auditors, let's say 5, 7 years back in terms of interfaces, ITGC, change management, DRP, those kind of stuff are being done by our business auditor itself. And the IT auditors, they are also moving up the ladder. So they are being trained and they are, being nurtured to do audits in more evolving technologies, be it AI, ML, blockchain, those kind of stuff.
Thank you, both of you. That was really insightful for young CAs. So let's move on to our next question. Major big, it's by Arijit Kumar Ghosh. Major big corporate organization nowadays have implemented SAP or like system for its activities, including accounting. In this situation of internal audit, requires does the internal audit requires reorientation on decision processes?
Bharat, let me try attempting it, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I think, Arijit, to your question, if I've understood correctly, yes, you're right. A lot of companies have adopted SAP or even other matured ERP systems. And in this situation, typically the internal auditor is not only, I would say, required to reorient the decision process. What is really important is how much are you able to understand the functionalities of any ERP. So as an internal auditor, you may not be equipped to understand the configuration, the different configuration which reside behind the ERPs, but at least you should be able to understand, uh, as to what is the workflow which has been enabled, what are the controls which have been put in place, where potentially the control can be broken down by somebody deliberately or maybe not so deliberately. I think that is what the internal auditor needs to be focusing upon when it comes to any ERP, be it SAP or any other one.
Thank you, sir. So our next question is not in the list, so I'll be just speaking that. It's by Mr. Mahesh Kumar Lakshmi Chand. What are the levels at which internal audit observations are discussed? Is it the responsibility of internal auditor to ensure that necessary action is taken on observation so that there's logical end to such observations? So I would like Mr. Bharat, if you can answer the same.
Yeah, Parul. So I think this is pretty straightforward. So there are two parts to it. One is with respect to, with whom the internal audit observation should be discussed. So definitely, as we go along, it makes sense, to discuss the observations across the hierarchy. So think of a scenario that, the observations or, the initial findings are not discussed with the process owners or with the persons with whom, you have conducted the audit, and you are sitting in front of the, the business head. So it may not make sense because there may be a different perspective to it. There may be a logical explanation to it. So typically what we follow, and these things are typically documented in the audit manual as well, that audit observations need to be discussed uh, as we go along with the, initial process owners, and we move up the ladder. It also makes sense that, we discuss it on a regular basis rather than waiting till the end of the audit. So that's about the one part. Secondly, again, it's very important. So, the audit is conducted, the observations are identified, there are certain risks which are there, which we have listed in the audit report. But it's also imperative that all of those risks are mitigated by the stakeholders, and there have to be an assigned ownership. So again, within our organization, and it depends on organization to organization, we have taken a call that depending on the severity of the particular audit issue, as to who should be the audit issue owner. So say, for example, if it is a high risk, so let's say, the head of the function or something like that. So we define, CO -1, CO -2. In case it's a medium, so not less than CO -2 will be assigned an audit issue ownership. So that's how we operate.
Thank you, Mr. Bharat. So, keeping the time in mind, I would like to conclude the session. And I would like to thank the faculty members, the participants, viewers, especially the organizers for the smooth conduct of the event. The total viewers for our event was 2,500. So that's a huge number. The recording, I would also like to thank the ISB board for giving us the platform to share the insights and views and enlighten the young chartered accountants from the learned faculty members. So thank you, Mr. Bharat, Mr. Saresh Jain, and Mr. Saket Mehra for giving your valuable time, and thank you so much. In the end, the recording will be uploaded on the ICAI website and the YouTube channel of ICAI. CPERs of the CPERs will be credited by the ISB board according to the login details. So thank you all. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, Balaji. Thank you, Saket ji.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Ji.
Saresh.
Bye bye. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Parul. Bye-bye. Thanks.